Secondly, what about councils? Women do not have access to legal and to accounting and to marketing and to capacity building and to R&D councils within the individual spheres and domains of businesses that they work. And I have a history of having established a non-profit organization, and I'm aware of the fact that there was very little facilitation provided to anybody who wants to do something de novo. And this is an area, and I'm trying to throw in some very tangible things that I hope can be picked up as recommendations for these conferences and can be brought to the attention to the right quarters in the decision-making corridors within the country. Then, of course, women's access to markets. Last week, and I must share with you at the cost of digressing from the discussion with your permission, Mr. Chairman, last week I was at the Chamber of Commerce in Sialkot. I was very pleased to see many women there. The experience of being in the Chamber of Commerce in Sialkot was very illustrative about the way the state functions. Here is a city where the private sector has built an airport on its own, where the private sector has pooled in money and has made an export promotion bureau, where the private sector has made a dry port completely on its own and handed the keys to the government to run it. This is how I understand it. Where the private sector mobilizes resources out of corporate and business philanthropy and tells the government that they want to improve their roads through what is called a city package. Where the private sector and business entrepreneurs in a small little town that nobody ever knows about and that nobody ever talks about from where I come from, actually talk about civic responsibility, about social good, about pooling money into developing a filtration plant, about providing scholarships and so on and so forth, and I can continue to go on. It's a very illustrative example of what can be achieved with private sector ability. It's a very illustrative example of the areas where the state is failing to perform its function, and I think we need to step back. We need to get away from these political trivialities and the blame game that the media continues to foster, to focus on some of the substantive issues that will get the country going on a better footing, that will get us to focus on macroeconomic development, bettering the life of the people. And I threw in the example of Sialkot at the cost of taking an additional 2 minutes to show you that these institutional mechanisms as entry points for capacity building of women entrepreneurs and leaders exist within the country. And of course, it is the responsibility of the state to harness that good and to look at them as mechanisms for further developing them. Then, of course, in terms of within the broader remit of where the private sector is and what the state can do to foster the role of women in development, we talk about various regulatory measures, and we heard examples from Agrochemical and Citibank about and the possible indications of the role of regulation that can increase the participation of women in governance arrangements and management arrangements through statutes perhaps or through guidelines. And then of course there is this whole issue of women that are not on the radar, that work in the formal sector but in downstream areas. So what about regulation to make wage equitable? What about regulation, and again, the transport issue? And these things are things through which the state can make an intervention with private sector participation and make the effective role of women a lot more meaningful in the employment sector, with a view to cultivating an environment from which the leadership will emerge. Let me, in passing, also focus on the public sector. I come from Islamabad, and I know what happens in the ministries. I know that a lot of good happens, but I also know that with reference to women and their participation, there are issues. There's been a lot of talk about merit-based hiring, but the story is more than that. It has to do about the environment, about systems of accountability, about career structures, and what is very important in my mind, the whole issue of retention regulation. I know of very good women who've left for the UN system because the state could not provide them the right enabling environment, could not match the incentives, and because the right retention regulation was not in place. That is no rocket science. That does not take money to do. but that requires some astute thinking to put in place. I completely agree that with reference to institutionalizing capacity building and leadership mentoring, there are very many entry points, and I seem to see that the consensus is evolving towards the establishment of an institutional entity which could provide as an oversight mechanism and could mentor and could oversee and perhaps could establish norms and standards. The moderator has referred to a glass ceiling commission. It's a very novel idea indeed. And throughout the course of the deliberations, I continue to sense that there is a move towards the creation of a new institutional entity. I would support it indeed, but we need to be very cognizant of the right parameters that need to be put in place. We have to be mindful of the fact that we must not create anything de novo, that there are institutes in place which could act as apex bodies. There are chambers of commerce, there is the National School of Public Policy, there are universities, there is of course the Society for Training and Development that is the host for this event, and I think any new initiative must take these in partnership and create a very clear vision on what needs to be achieved, on what are the deliverables and what are the means of doing that, but my sense is that this is clearly doable. In the end, and my first point, it actually goes back to something that Secretary Coker said, and I think he made a very important point. He said that the country is going through very turbulent times. I think that is our overarching context. Let us be reminded that that is a fact. Even when we talk about our own hobby horses and our own wish lists, let us be reminded that we live in very precarious times. Let us also be reminded that we are also living in a time where there's a global recession. And although the lack of integration of Pakistani financial markets has precluded the importation of the crisis into the country, the crisis will hit you, and it will hit Karachi soon, unfortunately. We have to brace ourselves for that. So the country has a macroeconomic downturn, unfortunately, that the IMF has barely rescued. We have, unfortunately, one of the poorest social sector indicators, but we are a great nation. And I think that we need to brace ourselves for that environment. Leadership is absolutely key to coming out of this crisis. And because women are 50% of the population, 50% of the workforce, and I think somebody made this point earlier, I think the moderator did, it is absolutely imperative that we create the right environment, that we cultivate the right structures, that we create that we actually engage with the right institutional for this country, for this great country and for this great nation, which must and has to be saved. We all must be very clear on the role that we have to play. If we're good managers, so be it. If we're good leaders, we have to get out of our homes because this is the time. And just in passing, I cannot resist saying towards the end that I think it is as far as the issue of women in leadership is concerned, the entire game is about attitudes. Because even as we sitting here, the panelists and the corporate chiefs talk about play environments in the workplace. Nobody talks about equality. I have never heard the corporate bosses talk about the men in the corporate sector share responsibility with women, take them as their equal, hold their hands in their domestic chores. It's always about creating the play environments in the workplace so that women can just pop up from their desks and tend to the child. And I think unless that is going to change, that we will continue to gather year after year.